but now we have Sarah, and I'm very excited to have you here, Sarah. Sarah is focusing on UX design and is also a faculty at Lesley University College of Art and Design, and is very much focusing on gender and racial bias. This is truly a very important and current topic and issue in AI right now. So please, Sarah, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you all. And it's nice to meet you all this morning and to be a part of this very important conversation. So hello, everyone. Welcome to my talk, Understanding the Changing Role of the Designer as a Force for Good in a Racially and Gender Biased, now increasingly AI-powered world. Thank you, Jan, for the introduction. My name is Sarah Pagliaccio. As mentioned, I'm principal of Black Pepper. I'm a user experience researcher and app designer based in Boston, Massachusetts, and I do teach interaction design, also using the design thinking methodology at Lesley University in the College of Art and Design. I'd just like to start by discussing some of these everyday examples, and I think the two wonderful gentlemen who went before me have pointed out a lot of these already. But I think, as I said, increasingly, we are holding these AI tools in our hands. They're on our shelves, on our kitchen counters, and in ways that I think a lot of people sort of take for granted these days, right? And Siri, Cortana, Alexa, anything with voice recognition is relying on AI and machine learning, right? To answer your questions, to turn on the lights, to play music around the house, tell us what time it is. They're in our phones and everyday uses, using Google Photos, for instance, right? It uses AI-powered facial recognition tools to do simple things like organizing photos. This app is working so well now, if you consider this a good thing, that it not only recognizes our humans in our life, it can tell apart our children, can tell friends from cousins, categorizing people and places that we've been. It also now recognizes our pets. It can tell the difference between our old golden retriever and our new golden retriever, which is an interesting observation about the things that we find important in our culture these days. You can even train it to serve up specific memories and to hide specific memories for you. So it will not show you certain times or places, people that you'd rather forget, but will also do some normalizing of serving up the best photos from birthday parties, anniversaries, things like that. And best is defined by these algorithms. Many of these tools really genuinely are providing tangible incremental improvements in our daily lives, right? So things like you may also like when you're purchasing. Obviously, that's to get you to buy more, but often those suggestions get better and better. There's a faster route, when you're driving, things like that. Fraud detection on your credit card. These are all really genuinely helpful tools and benefits in our everyday existence nowadays, things that we rely upon so heavily. But not all of these tools are helping people. They're certainly not all helping people equally. There are new so-called efficiency tools being rolled out, especially from working from home during the pandemic. These tools are basically spying on people to figure out whether or not they're working, whether or not they're active on their computers. There are new voice recognition is becoming ubiquitous, and new cars. But they historically have trouble listening and understanding commands from women drivers, which can obviously have pretty big impact on half the population who happens to be driving and can cause serious accidents. There are new voice recognition tools that are meant to help disabled people just go about their daily lives again, using their computers, communicating with people. But a lot of these voice recognition tools are sort of notoriously mishearing or misidentifying words spoken by anyone who has a disability that affects their speech patterns. So more often than not, it seems to me these days that these tools are helping corporations, not necessarily helping the end users they are meant to be serving. When I do this talk here in the US and amongst the design community, I typically have to define AI for these groups. I think a lot of folks here probably already understand this. You know, AI is the computer science based on machine learning and big data. In traditional programming, to get a computer to do something for you, you have to give explicit instructions to the machine. In machine learning, you're asking for what you want with examples instead of instructions. And I tend to massively oversimplify this when I explain it. I liken it to the matching games we played as kids, or that some of us may now be playing with our own kids. You show the computer a picture of a horse and it labels a set of pictures as horses. You tell if it's right or wrong, and it learns from your answers. Again, a massive oversimplification, but it helps to transition the conversation to what we really need to talk about. What is the training data in these tools? What are they being trained on? And the training data in the US is owned exclusively by big tech, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft. They know what's in their training data more than anybody else does. And there's not a lot of transparency in to know what they're really using to train these tools, except for some more recent research that's come out, which allows us to know that their training data is problematic. Recent research has disclosed that some of these data sets are smaller than desired and highly homogenized. At least one of the big five trains its facial recognition software on a collection of images more than 77% male and more than 83% white. The end result of this is misidentification of anybody non-white, and can lead to really egregious results, like people who are wrongly identified and wrongly arrested. Black men end up with criminal records because of misidentification using facial recognition here in the US. The voice recognition apps, this one almost gets a bit comical. The voice recognition apps largely favor white men from California. The average word error rates are 35% for Black speakers and 19% for white speakers. So that's a very significant difference. They're 13% more accurate for men than for women. These are white men versus white women. And this last one is my favorite. And I sort of use the word favorite loosely, but my husband is Scottish. So sometimes around the house, we get a laugh about this, although it is pretty serious. The average Scotsman has a less than 50-50 chance of being understood by voice recognition apps, which is too bad if you're lost in a rural road in the rain asking your phone for directions, because I'm sure that never happens in Scotland. I don't mean to make light of these things, but it does take on an aspect of the ridiculous almost when you see how many people are left out of these data sets. There are massive data sets now being used to train natural language processors. These, again, we see disadvantage a lot of women and minorities, any peoples with less access to the internet than wealthy, mostly white communities, which means that any AI generated text based on these natural language processors, like the new Google and Microsoft suggested text features that I think a lot of us are seeing in our texting apps and in our emails, they will perpetuate wealthy and or white speech patterns, which in turn just perpetuates gender stereotypes, racial biases, and can have a huge effect on potential hate speech. Some of these data sets are too small. One of them, at least, is too large. And there were two primary researchers who pointed out the dangers of using these huge data sets for natural language processing, like the ability to perpetuate hate speech through AI-generated text. Those researchers were fired for submitting their work to an academic conference. Maybe some of you already saw this in the news, but Doctors Timnit Gebru and Margaret Mitchell, they were Google's co-leads of the ethics and AI team in California, were fired for sharing their research, revealing these findings with an academic conference. I personally don't believe it's a coincidence. They were both women, one's an immigrant from Africa. They were fired for doing their jobs. They were meant to be pointing out the ethical implications of the work going on in AI at Google. I like to say that machines are only as smart as the humans training on, with the emphasis on mans here. Women make up just 12% of AI researchers. here in the US. And this number isn't getting better. More women than men lost their jobs or had to give up their jobs over this last year as a result of the pandemic. There was a crazy statistics somewhere between November and December when the end of the year jobs report came out that 1 million jobs were lost at the end of the year. They were all women's jobs towards the end of the calendar year last year due to COVID. These biases, they're not really new news. We've known about this research since around 2017, 2018. And I like to joke that that's a long time in internet years. And these biases aren't going away on their own. Here's another example. AI will fill in the word queen in the sentence, man is to king as woman is to blank, but also fills in the sentences like father is to doctor as mother is to nurse. This example was from an article published by Harvard Business School. The article was titled HBS's 4 Best Practices for Machine Learning Teams to Avoid Gender Bias. The article went on to say, quote, the inherent gender bias in this remark reflects an outdated perception of women in our society that is not based in fact or equality. I agree it's not based in equality, but unfortunately it is based in fact. It's based in the historical facts and the historical data that are being used to train the machines. These facts are being copied and pasted all over the internet thanks to these big data sets and the ubiquitous nature of the control that the big 5 tech companies have over our lives these days. Here's another example from MSN.com. The team at Microsoft decided to replace the human journalists with robot editors using AI software. The AI algorithm illustrated a news story about racism with a photo of the wrong mixed-race member of the band Little Mix. The machines couldn't tell the difference between these 2 women in a story about racism. Last year, Twitter had to look into why its AI algorithm used to generate photo previews apparently continuously chose to show white people's faces more frequently than Black faces. Several Twitter users had to point this out to the team at Twitter. They were testing this out by posting. You can include multiple photos in an individual post on Twitter. And so they were posting pictures of a Black person and a picture of a white person. And the preview always chose the white face over the Black face, even when the 2 people mentioned were Mitch McConnell and President Barack Obama in the post. It's not a coincidence then that the big tech employees are mostly white and male. These numbers are from a Wired magazine article published all the way back in October 2019. Just to share one statistic, the article reported that the share of Black technical workers at Apple was unchanged at 6% after years of keeping an eye on tech diversity. This is less than half of their representation in the US general population. And the arts community, although less male, is also largely white and therefore also susceptible to these kinds of biases. We talk about repeated design patterns, right? We repeat the familiar, we repeat the comfortable, we repeat what we consider normal. Meanwhile, at least here in the US, I'm not sure outside of the US, but here in the US, women are driving the majority of consumer purchasing decisions. Yet our needs are being largely ignored. In some sectors of the economy, this number is as high as 90 to 95%. And in places that we consider as being traditionally dominated by male decision-making, including in car buying, the number is as high as, I think, 80 to 85% amongst car purchases. Women are making these decisions. In the meantime, in the US anyway, we're rapidly becoming a majority non-white country. And depending on who you ask, racism is costing the US economy as much as $16 trillion. So if you look at this decision-making and look at all these biases purely from an economic perspective, we're really ignoring these non-white audiences and customers, users of our design solutions at our peril. Not to mention how we could be potentially perpetuating all of these gender and racial biases. So I'm often asked what we're meant to do about these things. What, as designers, can we actually do about this? And it may sound a bit trite, but obviously the answer is to start by educating ourselves. Whether we realize it or not, these biases exist in any algorithmic powered tools. Any Google search we do, any image generator or name generator we may already be using. So they're really actually present even in basic things like the extensions that you can get on Adobe Creative Cloud. This is one of the major design tools that we use here in the US. There's another product called Sketch that has extensions that allow you to do, it'll automatically generate images for you. And when you can place those in your designs, these image generators are largely just giving you more white faces to place in your design, which perpetuates the notion that we're only designing for white people. These really seep into our design processes, especially when we're short on time or just not paying attention or just unaware that these processes that we're susceptible to these kinds of biases. I did an informal survey of persona templates just using a Google search last year for an article that I was writing. And when you do an image search for persona templates on Google, you just get a sea of white faces, and those are the templates that are recommended, is just more white people. We should obviously be educating ourselves, watching the documentaries, reading all the books, listening to the podcasts. Coded Bias, the documentary on bias in AI in the US and the effects of these biases, is available now on Netflix for streaming. We don't even need to go out and hunt it down now amongst you can go to the Coded Bias website and it'll tell you where you can watch it locally. But also, I recommend that people all take the implicit bias test. This is from a team at Harvard, to learn what your own implicit bias is. This is not as a tool to brag about how little bias you have, but just as an understanding of where you fall on the scale of in-group versus out-group bias. And then to take that information and just know that we can all do a bit better. We have a saying here in America, fake it until you make it. You need to act like an unbiased ally in order to become an unbiased ally. But knowing where your own bias lies is a good first step. Obviously, educating others, just spreading the word to our fellow designers, our peers, people we mentor, our bosses, decision makers. Just spreading the word is super important. And as a design educator, I also try as much as possible to weave these stories into my lectures, into my curriculum. I teach interaction design. I want my students to understand about inclusive design and accessibility. And when I say accessibility, I don't just mean for people with recognized disabilities, right? Accessibility in terms of reaching broader audiences. I try to get my students to practice designing with big data sets. I give them sample data sets to work from. They're allowed to choose amongst a series of data sets that fall within their areas of interest. But then we really talk critically about what's in the data sets and what's not in the data sets. And I try to teach them to design infographics that won't mislead, depending on the information that's explained, and making note of the information that's not present in some of these data sets. It includes a crime data from the city of Chicago in the Midwest here in the US that has a largely diverse population and serious crime problems, as well as things like sports statistics. The data set on sports statistics seems like a lot of fun. I think my students like to dig into that one. And then I think I maybe suck the joy out of it a little bit when I start talking about income inequity based on the genders of the sports teams, the race of the players, how things like injuries may not be part of the data set, how whether or not the players are paid when they're benched, things like that we need to know about, whether or not they're cared for when they experience concussions or injuries that mean that they can't play at all. So what does that mean from again, a gender and racial bias perspective, and how do you weave that into just a basic infographic about what teams perform better than others in this case. And I really, really try to try myself in my own work when I'm teaching to my students and when I'm working across teams. As a consultant, I have an opportunity to work with a lot of different teams. I'm lucky in that I get to engage with lots of different people. And I am often in a position where I'm speaking about the process, about the design thinking process and how to be inclusive in my design practices, as well as when I'm teaching with my students. You know, I like to point out that it's really important just to ask for basic demographic information when we're recruiting our research participants. I'm not sure why, but somewhere along the way, at some point in my career here in the US, it became somewhat gauche to ask for this information. But it's just so essential to know who we've reached out to, who we actually have spoken to, and who we haven't. And that makes it especially important just to recruit outside our usual friends and family networks. Again, this may sound oversimplistic, but when we're short on time, what we fall back into our own familiar habits, these tend to be knowing that we are typically white people speaking to more white people. If we stick within our usual friends and family networks, we are at risk of perpetuating our own biases and repeating those biases in our design patterns and not reaching broader audiences, not reaching the people that we need to be inclusive about. I also try to encourage people to understand what's in their big data sets and what isn't. Because of strict roles and sort of the way teams are organized often here in the US, when I come in as a consultant, there are often groups of teams that are responsible for the data sets within these organizations that I often don't get to talk to, that are siloed apart from the people responsible for the design and then the people responsible for the development. But really, if we're meant to be representing the users of our design solutions, right? In my case, I'm a user-centered designer. I'm meant to be representing the users, right? We are meant to be the humans in the human-computer interaction. We shouldn't assume it's someone else's job to know what groups of people are overrepresented or underrepresented in the data sets that are used to power the apps that we are designing. So I always encourage the folks that I'm working with and my students to try to get access to these data sets. You know, maybe there's a data analytics person. I try to make friends with that person, right? There may be a team responsible for this. They might not be looking for the same things that we're looking for as human-centered designers. I always encourage people to check their work, right? As a solo practitioner, I try to work with my clients, my extended teams, to make sure that I'm not the only one looking at my own research results, that I'm not biasing my own results. I try to record and transcribe, in particular, the qualitative research that I do. And then I try to recruit someone to provide checks and balances for that work. I always look for someone who isn't biased by the interpersonal interactions that I experience during interviews and field observations. It's so easy to either emphasize with someone who feels familiar, someone who feels like part of your own in-group, and then to be dismissive of input from folks who are part of an outgroup or who you identify with less on a personal basis. And in the absence of human help, sometimes I actually rely on some of these AI tools. I use text sentiment analysis sometimes to score my research results, especially when I'm looking at qualitative research. I plug comments in, I plug the transcripts from my interviews into natural language processors so that I can get back the more objective scoring of whether or not the comments that people were making are positive or negative. This gives me a more objective understanding. It supplements the work that I'm already doing, right? It's not a replacement for it, but it supplements the work that I'm doing to understand whether or not the words that were used by research participants are positive or negative. I try to do this by taking the transcription, sort of letting it sit a bit, so I get a little bit distant from, again, my own potential biases or whatever I'm bringing to the conversation. I plug it into these tools, and then I try to use the scores that are given back, so I can tell my teams, I can combine this qualitative research with quantitative data. I try to turn those numbers into data-driven storytelling infographics of my own. So whenever I'm creating a journey map or a customer experience map, I can really provide a more robust reflection of what's going on. And I often find that it not only reduces my own bias, but it helps get buy-in to some of these artifacts and tools during the design process as well. It gives people something that they can argue with a little bit less. So I really encourage folks to get to know these tools a little bit better, whether you're designing for them or designing with them. Sometimes these tools can be our friends, but we really, really need to understand the way that inclusive design practices become even more essential than ever before, with an understanding of both the gender and the racial bias that are present in these algorithms and in the basic data sets that are used to power these algorithms. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you very much indeed. And I'm really glad that we had, both the historical and current perspective of the problem. I don't want to be boring and then giving us some kind of a legal contextual information, just to mention what, by the way, Vladan already mentioned a little bit, that in the EU we are very much focusing on these issues. The European Commission established 2 years ago the special so-called high-level expert group on AI. They were very clear that they needed both gender and other balances in the group. So it was quite a remarkable group of experts. They came with 2 very important recommendations, focusing on ethics and also addressing all the bias and other problems. Without going to any details, we have some kind of draft of the AI regulation on the table right now. But I would like to have one simple question in our last 5 minutes for both of you. Do you believe that we need some kind of hardcore regulation? Do we need some kind of law regulating AI? And I'm not talking about Asimov 3 laws of robotics to stay with the sci-fi metaphor, but I'm talking about 100 pages long kind of legal stuff. So do we need something like that, or is it possible to do this like this soft law, this soft way, like Sarah just presented, to be more educated, to look at the data sets, to be more clear about our intentions in our work. So what do you think? Do we need to regulate the AI, or is it some kind of self-regulation? Could it be enough? Maybe we can start with Mushon and then back to Sarah. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I think the short answer is yes. I think there's a lot of room for even though the discussion for a long time, especially coming from the US and especially coming from Silicon Valley, is that you don't regulate the internet. And if in this framing, it's really easy to win a lot of people over arguments of free speech and kind of hit the libertarian nerve that exists not only in the US, but in the whole world, especially around technology. But what we're seeing with the EU, we see that the EU is actually affecting the discussion and changing not only what is allowed to happen within the EU, but what is worth happening globally. So what we've seen in recent years is that the EU is re-entering that space as a political power. I will say, however, and I mentioned that briefly in my talk, that I find the framing of debiasing limiting, because bias is human. Like, and in a lot of cases, like, we need to put people to build kind of frameworks of understanding. It's not like when we're hoping that we'll get to a point that a system would not be biased, that it would be objective, then we're perpetuating the same myth. While I think what might be more useful, and I think the designers have a lot of say there, is to work into a framework of the benefit of the doubt. It's a great term, the benefit of the doubt, because there's a lot of benefit in the doubt, but we don't see that benefit often enough. I think that there's room to learn bias not as a way of working towards perfecting the system, which would be like debiasing basically means like include me in your normalization. No, let's understand that this normalization is a very messy process that would not be perfect and should be framed within the framework of a doubt.
And that was really well said, and I agree with Mushan wholeheartedly. I'm a little bit jealous, to be honest, because I do think the EU is a little bit ahead of the game here in the US, and I don't know if that's just because we rely on these big tech giants here so much. I mean, you know, not as daily users of these tools, but the US economy is so powered by these tech companies right now that there's a lot more conversation about getting them to pay their fair share of taxes than understanding how Jeff Bezos became a multi-billionaire as a result of the pandemic, right? And how they are really creating these capitalistic monopolies, and that they're not respecting people's privacy, and that they're not using their powers for good, I would say, right? And that's creating more problems than anything else. And often you see just absolutely ridiculous stories of when these when the CEOs, you know, when Mark Zuckerberg goes to present in front of Congress, you know, there have been these big congressional hearings here, but they get treated like celebrities. That it's absurd. And that for some reason we can't seem to get our own legislators educated around the dangers of these technologies. And I would like to see more of that happen here. And I would like to see us adopt more universal rules that are more in line with this forward thinking that the EU is taking. Global rules might be a little bit harder because, for instance, the Chinese government is using these tools to control their populations. But at least having some kind of set of standards, right, to work towards would be a good thing, I think, for all of us.
Thank you both. Thanks a lot. I can agree with both of you more. Just one little remark, very short. Unfortunately, sometimes these very good intentions are being used as a cover for what we call the strategic autonomy. And that basically means protection of the European market against US, UK, and also Israeli companies and scientists. So we really have to be careful because, for instance, right now, while our French friends especially are trying to exclude Israeli researchers from the Horizon program. So and based on the strategic autonomy and regulation of AI. So we need to be really careful about the good intentions and the ends. So we are a little bit of jealous of the US approach as well, Sarah, being open to all kinds of researchers and entrepreneurs is also a great thing. So having said that, let me thank you both for a very wonderful contribution to this conference. We'll have just a short break for like 14 minutes, and then we'll welcome architect Stanislas Chaliu with his keynote. So thanks a lot, both, and thanks everyone. And please, I'm giving a word back to Yao. Thank you.